I have never been much of a Simpsons guy. Sure, it was definitely on a good bit as I was growing up, and I could probably have a very surface level conversation with somebody about it, but in general, it's just not a series that's been a huge part of my life. Despite this though, there are a few episodes that have stuck with me since first seeing them way back then, and none more than Homer's Enemy. Obviously, there's perhaps not an episode of this show that's been discussed more, but there's just something so interesting to me about a series, 180 or so episodes in, deciding to include this character that feels so antithetical to the world that the series has created. A character with the opposite of our protagonist's seemingly innate ability to get in and out of trouble. A character who's stuck facing the realities of the world that our main crew just get to ignore. A character who's at odds with his world for all of those reasons, tries his hardest to get his point across and yet loses everything anyway. A character who's also a yellow dog, and wait, at some point there, I feel like I started talking about a different episode. Seriously though, as fun as it would be if its title was a lie, this video is actually about Jermaine, one of Adventure Time's most interesting episodes and characters. And while there are a ton of comparisons between Frank Grimes and Finn and Jake's brother, including a few more inconsequential parallels that I neglected to mention, I'm actually going to spend this video mostly talking about the main difference between them. And even though these two do diverge in quite a few ways, from the fact that Jermaine is related to Jake, to the idea that Frank's situation is significantly less actually his fault, the biggest difference between them really comes in where we leave these characters by episode's end. While Frank Grimes ends up being discarded, a neat little character study that the world leaves behind, Jermaine instead ends up being given the ability to change, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this video, I really want to dive into how the show presents Jermaine as both being left behind to sweep his brother's dust, and as a son who just has to learn to let go.
You okay, man?
No, I'm fine. Everything's fine.
Oh.
Despite the fact that Jermaine technically appeared before this point in the series, it's pretty clear that this is really our introduction to the idea of Finn and Jake's brother as an actual character, and therefore it's quite interesting how they choose to bring him into this world through one of Adventure Time's fantastic dream sequences. And while there is a lot going on in this scene, including some beautiful visuals from single episode storyboarder Brandon Graham, it's the first image of Jermaine that leaves this immediate impact, with the tombstones of the boy's parents being portrayed literally weighing on him as the flower between them begins to wilt. Throughout this episode, there will be a lot of symbolism without an exact or sometimes seemingly any explanation, with Jake even musing about why Jermaine was wearing a bear suit in the dream, only for it to be revealed that that's just what he sleeps in. But I do think it's fairly clear what the general idea behind this first glimpse at the character is. Jermaine is still living with his parents hanging above him, and it's not exactly doing him any good. There is a bit more of Jermaine in this dream world, with us getting a glimpse at his concentration technique of just listing random Greek words, but we're quickly taken away to the real world happenings of the treehouse, and there certainly is a good bit happening. In the midst of all of these delightful shenanigans, the show gives us a quick glimpse at Jake's psyche throughout this episode before his brother enters it, and it's something that works really well. See, throughout a good chunk of this episode, Jake, and especially Finn, will need to become a bit more of an idea than an actual character, with the 11-minute runtime being soaked up quite a bit with the task of establishing both the character of Jermaine and giving him this really interesting story. So getting this little section out of the way about Jake's entry into the back half of his life, giving him some perspective on family, was likely necessary. There is one little piece here that I do find interesting though, which is how Jake immediately imagines a world where his kids end up like his father's, and how he immediately hates it. Throughout the remainder of this episode, it will be revealed that the lack of a real relationship between Joshua's kids is because one of them is stuck trying to respect his father's legacy, when Joshua would almost certainly rather just see his kids getting along. We'll get back to that heart-wrenching irony in a second, but first, after some beautiful visuals of a journey across Ooo, we finally arrive to meet our titular hermit, who is immediately this immensely relatable and likable character. I think some of this may come from the fact that we do get a slightly more irritating version of our main duo within the confines of their old home, but it's pretty hard to not immediately begin to sympathize with their third brother, something that makes the following revelations especially rough. While it's been hinted at throughout this entire episode, it's here where we fully learn what Jermaine has been up to, taking care of the magical mess that his father left behind, a task that includes keeping up his side of the fight against demons, a fight that started before Jermaine was even around. Just like the rest of this episode, this pretty depressing situation is softened by some lighthearted depictions of it, with this Jermaine and Bryce conversation being just really well done comedically, but it's still hard to come out of this scene without the same expression as this terrific Finn and Jake frame. Complete shock that Jermaine is actually living like this. The entire time that we've watched our duo have these fun and grand adventures across Ooo, Jermaine has been here, doing the same things over and over and over again, with a litany of demons ready to destroy him if he ever misses a single beat. And while this revelation is temporarily interrupted with a cute scene of the boys eating together, when Jake neglects to have the same level of caution as his brother, it nearly destroys the entirety of Jermaine's way of life, an event that finally pushes him over the edge. And while there have been a ton of great little moments in this episode before this one, as we slowly uncovered how the memory of Joshua has directed Jermaine to this unfulfilling life that he's been living for years, none of it compares to the final 3 or so minutes of this episode. While a lot of this interaction is portrayed through some goofier dialogue, with there being a pretty lengthy fart joke metaphor in here, I'll have the transcript up on screen whenever I'm talking about a specific line or moment. Anyway, as Finn pretty bluntly tells Jake and the audience, this is more than clearly a sentiment within Jermaine about the world around him that he's been holding in for a while. And with presumably the first non-demon company he's had in quite a bit, it was inevitable that it was eventually going to come out. Jermaine kicks off this scene with perhaps the part that sounds most like the episode I started this video talking about, accusing Finn and Jake's lifestyle as the reason for his daily struggle, an accusation that doesn't fully make any sense, but that's kind of the point. Deep down, as he'll finally admit in a second, Jermaine knows why this life of misery has become his, but he's not quite willing to face it yet, instead preferring a false narrative where somebody had to watch Joshua's stuff and his brothers both abandoned him to do it. This general jealousy of Finn and Jake is then continued, with him eventually claiming that Jake was always their father's favorite. Something that, when you consider Joshua's fascination with magic, was almost certainly true. Of course Joshua would spend more time with his superpowered son, and of course Jermaine would feel more than hurt by this. This episode is somewhat vague on whether or not Joshua assigned Jermaine's duty to him or if he just assumed it himself, with the former painting his father in a pretty horrible light, but I think the important thing is that Jermaine feels as if his father mostly loved his brothers when he was alive, only to leave him with the dirty work once he passed. As the facade of Jermaine's contentment begins to literally burn around him, Jake finally gets him to admit what has truly kept him in this miserable situation. It was always his choice. Jermaine admits that it's been his decision to stay. He admits that he created his own world, a world that has taken everything he had to offer and left him with nothing. After he admits this, the episode somewhat slows down despite the situation. allowing its titular character a moment to process everything about his way of life, only to end with him making a permanent decision about it.
Let it burn.
Huh? But all Dad's stuff!
No, I think it's all right.
Fading back into the episode, with the demons that once surrounded him disappearing along with the prison of his own design, we find Jermaine looking out into the world he's kept himself from, wondering what's next after allowing his world to burn. This isn't the final time in the series that we see Jermaine, with him having a few other appearances, but I would argue that this is the only episode that fully focuses on the character, and I think it's a more than well done dissection of him. Throughout Adventure Time's canon, the show obviously introduces more than a handful of characters, but there's perhaps none that feel as out of place in this magical and wacky world as Jermaine, a fact that makes his place in it as important as nearly anybody else's. All he had to do was look out his window to see the opportunity that the Land of Oo is willing to supply to those who search for it, as we see him take advantage of in future appearances. And yet, before this episode, Jermaine was just simply too focused on trying to respect his father, who he felt never respected him, to see any of it. As implied by the fact that his subconscious did connect with Jake through their dreams, and his own admission of such at the episode's climax, it's clear that at some point, Jermaine did realize the pointlessness of the endeavor that he had dedicated his life to, but just still couldn't let it go. To let it go would be to admit to himself that no matter what he does, no matter what he sacrifices, Jermaine will never feel appreciated by the man he said goodbye to so many years ago, and it's absolutely devastating. And while obviously the idea of an episode where Finn and Jake's childhood home burns down does sound like a bit of a bummer, it was perhaps the only thing that could have saved Jermaine. Even after admitting in this episode that he alone had chosen the struggle, there was no guarantee that he wouldn't just sink back into his lifestyle of fighting tooth and nail just to stay afloat. At least there would be no guarantee if he still had that lifestyle to turn back to. After years of pursuing some type of resolution to his relationship with his father and only finding misery, Jermaine has to find something else to look for. And it's that revelation that gives the character the good ending that he had always deserved. Anyway, that's about it for me. If you want a more direct way to tell me that I misinterpreted this entire episode in the comments, you can find my Twitter hidden somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in a week or two with a sadly priceless video. Thanks for watching.